Hi everyone. Today we are going to continue with the last part, document 1, which is about reflex action. First of all, we are going to start with the structure of the spinal cord. What are the parts of the spinal cord? What does the spinal cord consist of? This is the figure of the spinal cord. It is transverse section of the spinal cord. First of all, as you see in the figure, the spinal cord consists of gray matter and the outside one is called white matter. So the inner one is called gray matter, the outside one is called white matter. Along from the spinal cord, we have roots. We have dorsal root and we have ventral root. The dorsal root is the posterior one. Dorsal, it means posterior or back side, the back side root. And we have the ventral root, or we can call it anterior root or the front side. And the dorsal root and the ventral root all together, they end and form the spinal nerve. As you know that the spinal nerves, they are connected to all our body in order to be able to transmit nerve messages, okay, and receive from all our body organs. So the spinal cord till now consists of two matter, gray matter, the inner one, okay, and white matter, the outside one. We have these two dorsal, we call them the two horns that are on the dorsal side. Here is the dorsal side and here is the ventral side. Okay, on the dorsal side we have dorsal horns, and on the ventral side we have ventral or anterior horns. Okay, here is a more detailed figure. Okay, this is the white matter, inside is the gray matter. Okay, this is the ventral horn, this is the dorsal horn, and this is the dorsal root on the dorsal side, and below we have the ventral root. How can we distinguish between the dorsal root and the ventral root? We can distinguish between them concerning the presence of spinal ganglion. On the dorsal root or on the posterior root, we have a ganglion. Okay, it is represented in this form. Look here in the yellow part. We call it spinal ganglion. And the dorsal root and the ventral root, they end all together to form the spinal nerve. It's important to know the structure of the spinal cord and its label in order to be able to determine or to trace the pathway of the nervous message during a reflex action. Here again, another form for the spinal cord. It is showing you inside we have the gray matter, outside we have the white matter. We have here the dorsal root, which possesses the spinal ganglion, and here we have the ventral root. All along they form at the end the spinal nerve, which is a mixed nerve. Okay, and here is another diagram: gray matter, white matter, dorsal root. This is the spinal ganglion. Here is the ventral root. Okay, and what I want you to know here is that once you receive a message, once we are subjected to a stimulus and our body is going to our body receive a sensory message due to the stimulus that we are subjected to, we call such information, since it is received by our sensory organ, it is called sensory information or afferent. If I asked you how does it enter outside the spinal, how does it enter toward the spinal cord? How does it go through the spinal cord? Does it pass through the dorsal root or the ventral root? All you have to know is that once our body is subjected to a stimulus and the nerve message is going to pass through the spinal nerve, it is going to enter the sensory information that is received by our sensory organ, is going to enter through the dorsal root to go through to the spinal cord and to the brain to be analyzed or integrated. You know that the brain as well as the spinal cord, they form the central nervous system where the information is integrated or analyzed in order to send another message to the motor organs in order to achieve an action. And the motor message that is sent by the brain or the spinal cord is going to reach the muscle through the ventral root. Okay, now we will talk in details about the pathway of the nervous. Now, here we have four figures. Observe these four figures. What do we have? I'm going to ask you some questions. Okay, please try to focus on these figures, okay, and listen to my questions. If I asked you what is the common between all these figures, what is the common between them? If you see that the common between them is that in the four figures our body or my body is receiving a stimulus. We are receiving a stimulus. What do we mean by stimulus? A stimulus, any action that we receive it and causes a change in the body. It causes, it allows us to react. Any action that induces a reaction. Okay, here what is the stimulus? The temperature of the finger increases due to heat. This is a stimulus. Here is the same. Okay, this is a stimulus. Here is the knee is exposed to a stimulus. Okay, it is being hit. Okay, this is a stimulus. And here they are showing you once the eye receives light, when the light shines get more. Okay, if you notice the pupil of the eye, the pupil is the black one, the pupil, okay, gets smaller, it contracts. So once there is more light, the pupil of the eye contracts. Okay, here it is wider than here. So the common between these four figures, first of all, is that all of them, they are receiving a stimulus, right? What is the second common between them? If you notice that in the four figures, also our body is making a response. It is inducing a reaction due to the stimulus that we received it. How? Look here, once we feel heat, we are going to pull the hand away, right? Here is the same. The hand is pulled away. And here is the same. Once the muscle of the knee received a stimulus, if you notice that the leg raises, it raises up. And here, once there is a bright light, the pupil contracts and becomes smaller. So also, here we can also see that there is another common between them, is that due to the stimulus we are receiving it, there is a response. I'm going to tell you that there is another common between these figures. If you notice that all these actions that are happening, they are involuntary. What do we mean by involuntary? We mean by involuntary that they are happening without conscious, without thinking. Okay, they are happening rapidly and automatically without thinking. Okay, here we are pulling our hand without thinking. Do you think that I have to pull my hand away? Of course, no. You pull it directly. Here is the same, and here is the same. You don't think that, you don't know that the pupil of the eye gonna shrink or gonna contract. It is taking place without conscious. This is what we call it reflex action. So a reflex action, it is an involuntary and automatic action due to an external stimulus. So it takes a place due to, first of all, please, you have to be careful that the reflex action doesn't take a place without a stimulus. When there is a stimulus, it's going to take a place. And once it takes a place, you have to know that it is involuntary, you do not think about it, and it is automatic and very rapid. Because why I want you to know that it takes a place due to a stimulus, because there are many involuntary actions done in my body, okay, such as the heartbeat, breathing. These are involuntary, but the difference between, and also digestion, but the difference between these actions, which are involuntary, and the reflex action is that the reflex action gonna take place once you receive a stimulus. As you see in the previous figures, you are not going to pull your hand away unless you are subjected to a hot object, okay, or you are pricked by a pin, for example. And the same when the light shines up or is bright, okay, the pupil of the eye gonna shrink or gonna contract, and this is also taking a place without conscious and due to a stimulus, which is the light. So the reflex action takes a place, okay, due to an external stimulus, and it is an involuntary action and automatic. And when I say involuntary, I mean without conscious. To be more scientific, you have to know that the brain here is not involved, okay? The message is not going to travel up to the brain. As you see in the figures, okay, here, the message is going to be controlled by the spinal cord. And as you see here, we have a pathway represented in the figures. This pathway, which takes place during a reflex action, we call it a reflex arc. So what is a reflex action? It is an involuntary automatic action due to an external stimulus, and once it takes place, it is going to take place by a pathway called reflex arc. Okay, look at the figures, please. Here, we feel, sorry, we are subjected to a hot object or to a stimulus that is represented by heat. The pain receptors under our skin gonna receive the message. If you have a look here, this message gonna move, okay. The red line represents this message. Since this message is received by our sensory organs, okay, this message is called sensory message, okay, which gonna be taken by the sensory neuron. Look how much it is long, okay. So the sensory neuron gonna take the message, okay, from the sensory organ to enter inside the spinal cord through the dorsal root, as you see, okay. So as I mentioned before, the sensory or the afferent message gonna pass through the sensory organ toward the dorsal root to reach the spinal cord. Then this message gonna pass to another neuron. We call it interneuron. This interneuron, it plays an important role. It has many other names. We call it interneuron, relay neuron, or associative neuron. This neuron is going to transfer the information, the sensory information, okay, to another neuron. We call it motor neuron. Why it is called the motor? Because this neuron gonna take the message into the motor organ here, which is the biceps muscle, which is going to achieve a reaction in order for the hand to be pulled away, okay. So as you notice that during a reflex action, how many neurons are involved? As you see, 3 neurons are involved. We have the sensory neuron, we have intermediate neuron called interneuron or relay neuron, and we have motor neuron. And other than the 3 cell bodies, we have the spinal cord. It is involved during a reflex action and not the brain. Here is more detailed diagram, okay, once our receptors that respond to heat, once they receive a stimulus, okay, the message gonna move from the receptor through the sensory neuron toward the dorsal root of the spinal cord, okay, in order to be given to the interneuron. Here is the interneuron. The interneuron gonna transfer the information toward another neuron. We call it interneuron or relay neuron. This relay neuron, which is between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, it plays an important role in transferring the sensory information to the motor neuron in order to transmit the motor message, okay, to reach the muscle in order to achieve a reaction. The message is not going to go to the brain during a reflex action. The message is controlled by the spinal cord, and the pathway of such nerve impulse is called a reflex arc. Look here, here we have a complete label, and the label is very important, okay? We have a hot object, okay? Here, once the hand touches the hot object, the pain receptors in the skin receive a stimulus, right? Which is hot object. The stimulus gonna be taken, listen please, it's very important, by the long neuron, which is represented by the green pathway. Okay, this is the dendrite. This is the dendrite of the afferent. What do you mean by afferent? As I said before, afferent, it means sensory. Since this neuron is connected to the sensory receptors, we call it sensory neuron. So the dendrite of the afferent or sensory neuron gonna take this message, the sensory message, toward the cell body, which is inside the spinal ganglion, and then this is the axon gonna take it to the cell body of the interneuron, which is inside the spinal cord and mainly inside the gray matter. At this level, the nerve message gonna move the interneuron or the relay neuron gonna transfer the sensory information to the motor neuron, to the cell body of the efferent or motor neuron, and this is the cell body. Then it will move to the axon of the efferent neuron, which is represented by blue color, in order to reach the muscle. Once it reaches the muscle, you see the hand will be pulled away in order to protect us from damage. So the reflex action, it has a great advantage, is that it protects our body from advantage. Have you ever asked yourself, okay, why uh, why the reflex actions play an important role inside our body? Why why the nerve message is directly sent to the muscle and it doesn't go to the brain? Why the nerve message is controlled by the spinal cord during a reflex action and not by the brain? Why? This is, you have to know why, because um, if the message gonna go to the brain, it will take time and you will be hurt and you will suffer from a damage. So in order to avoid damage, okay, your body won't wait for the message to reach the brain. For that reason, okay, reflex actions, they ensure your survival. How do they ensure your survival? By being controlled by the spinal cord, and for that reason we say they are very rapid and they take place involuntary, without conscious. Here also another detailed diagram representing a reflex arc. What do we mean by reflex arc? I repeat, reflex arc, it is the pathway of the nervous message that is taking place during a reflex action. Look at the figure here. When you are pricked by a pin, okay, the receptors under your skin receive this message. Look, they are connected to the dendrites, okay. So The dendrites of the sensory neuron, here they mention it as the axon, sorry. The axon of the sensory neuron gonna receive this message. Okay, here it's more, it should be here dendrites. The dendrites gonna take the message, the sensory message, it's gonna enter the cell body of the sensory neuron, and then it will be taken by the axon to the interneuron, which is inside the spinal cord, which is going to transfer this information to the cell body of the motor neuron, which is inside the spinal cord also, but at the ventral or anterior side. Then the cell body of the motor neuron gonna take the motor information toward the axon in order to reach the muscle, which is the effector organ, in order to make a reaction. This is the pathway of the nerve message or nerve impulse during a reflex action. This is what we call it reflex arc. Look at the arrow. If they put for you this diagram and they asked you to trace the pathway, you put an arrow. Here is the beginning. It passes through the dorsal root, it enters to the spinal cord, and then it goes outside the ventral root in order to reach the muscle. Please be careful for the label. I'm going to make a quick revision concerning the label of the spinal cord as well as the roots as well as the spinal nerve. Okay, here we have this is the spinal cord. Up we have the dorsal side and down we have the ventral side, and we can distinguish between them by the groove. Here is the groove. Look here, the groove is long and thin. Here the groove, it is short and thick, right? Okay. These are dorsal horns and these are ventral horns. They are wider, okay? This is the gray matter. Inside we have the white matter. Up we have the dorsal root, which possesses the spinal ganglion, and down we have the ventral or the anterior root. And this is the spinal nerve at the end of the dorsal root and the ventral root. They are mixed together by the spinal nerve. So as you see, once your skin is subjected to a pinprick, the nerve message, the sensory information, gonna move through the spinal nerve of the hand in order to reach the dorsal root of the spinal cord. It is going to enter toward the interneuron, which is inside the spinal cord, and then this interneuron gonna transfer the information toward the cell body of the motor neuron, which is going to take it to the through the axon in order to reach the muscle, which is the effector organ, in order to achieve movement. The effector organ is also called the motor organ, and it is called motor because it is responsible for movement. It is the one that allows us to move our hand or to pull it away in order to avoid damage and avoid pain. Okay, so finally, concerning the reflex arc or the pathway, okay, here is, once we receive a stimulus, the message gonna be taken by the receptors, gonna be received by the receptors of the receptors of the sensory organs, and the sensory neuron gonna take the message toward the spinal cord. Inside the spinal cord, I repeat, we have the interneuron or the relaying neuron, which is going to transfer the information to the motor neuron, and then the motor nerves gonna take the message to the effector organs, which are the muscles most of the time, in order to make a response. Here is again another example. Here look, it is the nerve, the reflex arc, it is traced by an arrow. It is represented by an arrow. Okay, look here please. Okay, it is passing from the receptor cells of the sensory organ. They are entering through, this is the spinal nerve, this is the dorsal root, this is the spinal ganglion, This is the cell body of the sensory neuron in the spinal ganglion. It takes the message to the relay neuron or the interneuron, which gonna transfer the information to the cell body of the motor neuron, and it is going to give the message to the axon of the motor neuron, and which will take it to the muscle in order to achieve a reaction. This is the pathway or the reflex arc that takes place during a reflex action. So till now, what I want you to know, to be able to define a reflex action, to define a reflex arc, you have to be able to trace the reflex arc, to make a complete label for the structure of the spinal cord and the spinal and its roots, and you have to trace the pathway that takes place during a reflex action. How many actions do we have? As I said before, we have voluntary action, which takes place uh, uh, which is controlled by the brain and which takes place when we are in complete conscious, okay? And involuntary, it is controlled by the spinal cord that takes place unconsciously and without thinking. And in case of involuntary action, as you've noticed, we have a direct communication between the receptor and the effector organs, which is through the spinal cord and not through the brain. Here is another diagram showing you here the finger, it is receiving a source of heat, a stimulus. It is taken by the long neuron toward the dorsal root. Here is the spinal, the afferent neuron is taking the message through the dorsal root to enter inside the spinal cord. The interneuron gonna transfer the information to the efferent neuron, which will be taken by the axon of the efferent neuron toward the muscle in order to achieve a reaction. Here is the pathway of the involuntary and the voluntary action. During an involuntary action, you have to know that we have the internal receptors, okay? We have receptors inside our body, internal receptors that take place that ensure an automatic action or an involuntary action. This action will not be controlled by the brain, it will be controlled by the spinal cord. For example, we have here the cardiac muscle, okay, which is playing the role of an effector organ. The message is controlled once for the cardiac muscle to act. The message is controlled by the spinal cord and not by the brain. And concerning the voluntary pathway, the difference between them is when we are subjected to an external receptors, or to a stimulus. When the external receptors are receiving a stimulus, the message gonna pass to the sensory neuron, which will be taken to the brain. Unlike the involuntary one, it will be taken to the spinal cord in order to be controlled. Here it will be taken to the brain in order to reach the effector organ by the effector neuron, which is mainly the skeletal muscle. Finally, okay, you have to know that the speed of the nerve impulse or the nerve message, they are affected by, the speed is affected by many factors. What are the factors that affect the speed of conduction of the nerve impulse or the nerve message? This is very important idea. There is many questions concerning the speed of the or the velocity of the conduction of the nerve impulse. First of all, you have to know that the presence of myelin, okay, increases the speed of the nerve impulse. Okay, why? As I mentioned before, we have two types of conduction. You remember in video part 2, we've said that we have two conductions. We have saltatory and step by step. And the saltatory conduction, it takes place along a myelinated axon or myelinated nerve fiber, because the message gonna jump from one node of Ranvier to another due to the presence of myelin sheath. And in this case, the message will be considered faster than the one that moves along the unmyelinated axon, because it is going to move all along the unmyelinated axon, so it takes more time. So from here you have to know that the presence of myelin facilitates and speeds up the propagation of the nerve impulse along the nerve fiber. Second, we have the diameter of the nerve fiber. As the diameter of the nerve fiber increases, the speed of the conduction of the nerve impulse also increases. So the diameter and the speed, they are also directly proportional to each other. Once the diameter is bigger, okay, the nerve impulse is also faster. And once it is smaller, it will be slower. Second, we have the temperature. As the temperature increases, the speed of the nerve impulse increases. Also, the temperature plays an important role concerning the propagation of the nerve impulse. As the temperature increases, the nerve impulse gonna pass more rapidly. Look at this diagram. It is representing for you the effect of myelin sheath as well as the effect of the diameter on the speed of propagation of the nerve impulse. Look here, we have this is unmyelinated axon without myelin sheath, and this one is with myelin sheath. It is myelinated axon. Look how the nerve message it is moving. It is jumping from one node to another, and as you remember, it is a saltatory conduction. And in case of saltatory conduction, the speed is faster than that in case of unmyelinated axon, because here it is moving all along the axon, so it is taking more time, and the speed here it is lower, okay, slower. So myelin sheath speeds up the propagation of the nerve message. Moreover, the diameter of the axon, look here we have many axons. Look at the diameter. As you notice, as the diameter gets more, okay, increases, the speed, look here, it is not here, it is not clear. Okay, look here, the highest speed is recorded along this axon, which is with the highest, greatest diameter. Here the speed is 80 to 120 meter per second when the diameter ranges between 13 and 20 micrometer. Okay, so as the diameter of the nerve fiber increases, the speed of the nerve impulse also increases. They are directly proportional to each other. Please be careful for such information, because they are very, very, very important. Thank you. Any question, please ask me.